Hello, everyone. You're again with Charles with my Z. See, I even changed the name, so it's not my best day, but actually, it's my one of my best guests actually joining today.
Oh,
I've been following Ted Trafford for quite some time. He's one of the LinkedIn influencers, I have to say. Even Dirk from Casta was asking for influencers, and he was the first one to be named there. So Ted, you're doing a good job there.
no,
Um,
thank you.
Ted defines himself on LinkedIn as a clinical research director, strategic advisor, and problem solver. And now I'm putting another label, industry influencer as well. Ted, I'm extremely happy to have you. Welcome. And giving the words to you to introduce yourself for the people that accidentally haven't heard about you.
Oh, thanks, Maya. It's so great to be here today. And I've been working in clinical research for 29 years now. And I've actually spent my entire career with the same company, Probity Medical Research, which I know is a bit of an anomaly in the clinical research
It
industry.
is.
But
Absolutely.
yeah, I started my journey as a research assistant slash study coordinator, spent 20 some years as the managing director of the company, and now I focus on business development at Probity Medical Research. And Probity is a clinical trial administrative support company that has a network of 70 clinical trial sites spread across 4 countries. So
Wow.
I think that is really relevant to our discussion today.
Yeah, and when you say our discussion, I just wanted to remind the audience that this is actually part of of my mini series on the importance of understanding the standard of care before starting any clinical trial. And indeed, that's thanks for mentioning that you have these 70 countries across 4 different countries because um, in the core of standard of care is actually understanding the country specific standard of care.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm more than happy to discuss that with you and understand your firsthand experience. But before that, I want to start with the question I asked you just before we started our conversation, which was because it's indeed our first conversation ever. I mean, I've been following you, but it's really our first conversation today. And so I was very curious to understand um, what is the one thing if because I'm pretty sure I know that you're observing the whole research industry, but if we speak about the one thing that you're most passionate about today when it comes to the research industry, what is this one thing that?
So that's actually a really difficult question. But when you asked that question, the first thing that popped into my head was the burden that the clinical trial industry is placing on sites in how they design and operate the clinical trials. And then, of course, that burden extends over to the participants as well. But sites are really struggling
Mm,
with everything that's been offloaded to them and everything that they are now asked to do that hasn't historically been part of what they do in clinical trials. And it's affecting so many aspects of the conduct of those studies as a result.
yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you. I've never been a part of a site. Um, but let's say a couple of years ago, I was very frustrated because I was supporting a few patients to start a screening process with a few sites uh, across Europe, and none of them were replying all of our emails, even though we provided very good information, like short information on the patients, their eligibility, like the why
Yeah.
we believe they can be eligible, and so on and so forth, why it's quite urgent. We tried giving them a call. It was very, very difficult. And I
Hmm.
was really pissed on sites. I was like, these sites, they're the ones not like helping the industry. And then I had to work with a few sites firsthand,
Yeah.
with few investigators. Um, Also, I was in a room full of key opinion leaders in oncology. I think in Czechia. I was speaking at this event, and I started hearing stories of people who decided to no longer do any clinical trials. So I decided to join their conversation, started asking them why.
Yeah.
You will be on the front end of research of medicine, and you get to offer more options to your patients. Tell me. And when they actually started giving me stories of what it actually is conducting a clinical trial from the investigator's perspective, that's just one perspective, then I was like, okay, there is a whole new universe that I don't understand now. And I started researching. And imagine in the States, for example, you have the professional sites that are all they do is research. But in Europe, that actually is not that common. I mean, there are professional research sites, but most of the sites are actually just everyday hospitals and clinics.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
on top of everything else. So yeah, the
That's
burden of
right.
sites is definitely something that I'm passionate about. But Ted, I wanted to understand your perspective of the burden, and how much do you believe this burden comes from the lack of understanding of the standard of care of the patients, the local specific standard of care, their patient pathway.
Yeah, the burden on sites affects so much and so many different aspects, and a big part of it is time.
Mm-hmm.
And so understanding the patient, I'm going to call it the patient journey, and what, how standard of care relates to that is I view standard of care as being, the treatments in that particular country, the programs that will be run to support the patient in that particular country for the indication that they are experiencing. But the patient journey, I believe, goes a lot deeper and a lot more in depth, in that it involves, from the time they first started having symptoms
Mm.
to, finding a physician. In some cases, it's very hard to get seen by a physician in some countries.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to go through many different physicians in order to find one who is going to understand what's going on with you and actually provide a concrete diagnosis. So that patient journey is many steps along the way. It could involve many different people. And, I think personally, just back on my own experiences with medicine, my mother struggled for 12 years before she was diagnosed
Oh
with
wow.
SLE. And so, that journey is burned into my brain.
Mm.
And so, how does that then relate to clinical trials? How does that relate to site burden in clinical trials? I remember in the early days when I was very active in the clinical trials at our site, we would spend a lot of time engaging with other physicians who were seeing patients that had the conditions that we were doing studies for. And we had the luxury of that time because the studies were a lot simpler.
Mm-hmm.
And it was part of our recruitment, enrollment, engagement process. But as the years went on, the studies got much, much more complicated. The definition of eligible patients got so much more narrow that we just didn't have the time to spend engaging the other physicians, or getting out, engaging patient groups, because we were just spending so many time on the other things, which are always presented to sites as being urgent and important and immediate.
Now you just reminded me of the video that you recently shared about the clinical trial marathon and all these obstacles. I love that, by the way. I
Oh,
sent
thank
it
you.
to, yeah, I love that. I'm definitely gonna share that as a link in the description of this episode. Um, like you're starting to run, and suddenly there are obstacles coming your way.
Yeah.
You thought that's like a normal marathon, but actually you have to do that, and like another jump, and so on and so forth. It's a great description, actually, of exactly what you're saying now. These
Yeah.
protocols and all the things that are coming with that. Is it because of lack of resources that you no longer have as a site now, no longer have the time to engage with other doctors? Or is it, I mean, when I say resources, internal
Yeah.
resources, but I also mean, like, what about if you ask for these resources, like from the sponsors and CROs? And I've never been in such situations, so I'd love to learn more. What happens if you ask for extra resources for engaging with these doctors?
Yeah. Okay. So the pharmaceutical industry's approach to supporting sites on recruitment and enrollment is a really interesting one. So,
Okay.
in order to be a site that recruits well for clinical trials, that is really a uh, highly skilled task, highly skilled process in order to accomplish identifying, potential candidates who are eligible and are interested in the study. And the problem that we experience is the pharmaceutical industry doesn't value that side of, or that process, that area for enrollment and recruitment in clinical trials. Instead, a sponsor will spend a phenomenal amount of money engaging in an advertising agency
Yeah.
to help them recruit for a study, and
Oh,
won't provide adequate resources to the site to actually pre-screen patients and devise their own recruitment strategies. So, have you ever watched the show Shark Tank?
oh yes, I'm a huge
Okay,
fan.
okay. So in the show, for anybody who hasn't watched it, company owners pitch their company to investors to try and secure investment. And one of the common questions the investors ask is, what's the customer acquisition cost? And they want to know how much the company spends on advertising in order to obtain one customer. And so they use that to measure, the effectiveness of the company and the potential for growth. And so in clinical trials, we know that it's critical to have participants in our studies,
Yeah.
but we don't really have a clue what the true participant acquisition cost is. And we don't understand how much it varies by geography. So part of the challenge is that in clinical trials, it's not just a monetary cost, even though it's treated as such. So I use the example of the advertising agency where there's enormous amount of money spent. But the participant acquisition cost is also very much a time component. And so, advertising is just one piece of the cost. And so time is absolutely critical. And sites do not have the time to properly recruit, evaluate, pre-screen, study the patient journey themselves. And so as a result, that gets pushed aside as these other competing priorities take place. So the hours and hours and hours that sites spend on training, the time that sites spend dealing with devices or tech in clinical trials that doesn't work properly. All of that takes away from the ability for them to spend time connecting with potential candidates for clinical trials.
That, do I understand correctly? What you're saying is that sites no longer have the time to properly understand the candidates so that they can also think, where can we engage with these patients? Like, where can we find these patients? So they don't have the time to do this analysis on their patient journey, at what stage they get diagnosed, how, who basically do they trust, who's treating them or who's diagnosing them. They no longer have this time. If that's really the case, are the expectations from the site that the sponsor will provide this information? You're starting the trial, like, here's all the information that we've gathered about these patients. Go and conquer the world.
Well, I think that the sites actually have a fairly good understanding. So the physicians, they have I'd say a fairly good understanding of the patient journey. But where the time is lacking is to be able to sit down and actually review that, to talk to patients, to explore, okay, if this is where the patients are at in their journey, how do we connect and engage with them at that point where they are? And so it is a big lack of time and just ability to focus on those things.
Mm.
And I don't know, actually I was thinking about this, when you reached out and said you wanted to talk, and I was wondering, do you know if there is a patient journey questionnaire that is out there? Because we complete a lot of questionnaires in clinical research trials. So there's quality of life questionnaires and disease impact questionnaires. But do you know of a patient journey questionnaire that, explores how that individual was diagnosed? How many different doctors did they go to before they got that diagnosis? How long did it take them to get treatment, et cetera? Like, who was it that told them they might have the condition that they had?
Uh, that's a very good question, and that strikes exactly like in the area that I'm most passionate about. Actually, there is such
Okay.
a patient journey questionnaire. I wouldn't say it's a standardized thing. Don't get me wrong, but
Okay.
a lot of companies are doing the so-called market research, where
Okay.
they go out and survey patients. I would say that also advertising companies, other like patient recruitment type of companies, would also do that. The problem with these patient questionnaires is that sometimes so for example with site feasibility, how do you do site feasibility? um the best scenario is you go out to all the sites, or at least one, two, three per country, for example, to survey them what they think about the protocol. Do they think they have the patients? Is it feasible? And so on and so forth. And you would do it country by country. With a lot of these patient questionnaires, um, you focus on one, two countries max. You would a lot of these market research companies will just use, let's say, random people that they are working for years and years, and they may be even like expert patients, not the lay patients, which is a huge
Right.
problem because once you're a patient expert, you may remember the early days when you were diagnosed and so on and so forth. Maybe that's like 15 years ago, but things are changing all the time. And
Yeah.
actually, people will be super surprised, but the standard of care, defining the patient pathway, which is access to treatment, access to diagnosis,
Yeah.
timelines for that, and so on and so forth, is actually a lot more dynamic than people think, especially
Oh,
nowadays,
my
because
goodness.
there are
Yes.
20,000 plus clinical trials a year. I probably, I'm not quoting like don't quote me with this number, but it's thousands of clinical trials a year. And yes, I know 90% will fail, so not many actually gets to approval and to actually reimbursement after that. But there are treatments that are being reimbursed, and they're absolutely changing the universe of patients and their patient pathway. Um, and here, not only treatments, but also medical devices. So unless you actually do a real time type of study, real world study with patients from the country you're targeting, you can't be sure that you really understand the patient journey. And even one last thing on that, even I would say that even the site surveys are maybe not that timely, because usually these surveys get to the sites when you've already done a lot of the work around the protocol
Right.
and a lot of the work around the country selection. And so by the time you're going to the site to ask like for feedback,
Yeah.
especially
It's
if
too
you
late.
think about sites outside of the United States, it's kind of too late.
Correct.
Sometimes, and I completely understand sponsors, don't get me wrong here. Sometimes hearing the truth, especially when you spend so much time and money to get to where you are now, and someone
Yeah.
telling you this is not gonna work, you're like, but I spoke with this key opinion leader. They told me it's gonna work. You tell me it's not gonna work. Well, no,
Yeah.
it's gonna work.
Well, and that's just it. Like, and that's why I brought up the question of the patient journey questionnaires, because why are we not collecting this information in the clinical trial setting so that we
Mm,
can learn, because some enrollment in some of these studies goes
true.
on for a really long time. So why are we not taking the time to understanding the journey of the people that are participating in the studies so that we can then gain information and make decisions based on data that we're collecting in the studies? So, if I was a sponsor and I was committed to an indication or a therapeutic area, I would want to collect valuable information. And the questionnaires and the surveys that you mentioned, I kind of get the sense that they're more either um, either post-approval, where the pharmaceutical company is trying to understand the journey so they can market the drug, rather than in the clinical trial setting. And you mentioned
Yeah, in most
advertisers
cases,
doing
yeah.
market research. But unfortunately, a lot of the advertisers are not doing a very good job with the advertising for clinical trials. We have very few advertising campaigns that are effective anymore for clinical
Mm,
trials. And we either get flooded with respondents who don't meet the criteria, and the site is just going through referral after referral after referral and can't find anybody, or the pre-screening is too tight and we get no results at all. So
mm,
uh, the
interesting.
yeah, the social media advertising campaigns is a really tough space right now.
It is because it's also quite competitive and it's very expensive.
It
It's
is.
very, very expensive. I mean, um, I would argue that it's way more expensive to advertise your clinical trial than actually conduct patient focus groups at the
Yeah.
very beginning and engage the communities and like maybe even train the sites to do this outreach and connect with the other doctors. But yeah, that's definitely a big topic out there. And to me, the advertisement, I with one caveat, I believe that advertising does work. I mean, I don't know like now precisely, maybe something like changed, but in the past when I was involved with such global patient recruitment, I've seen advertising campaigns working quite well. Um, but I also have the feeling that these advertising campaigns are seen like the pill, like we human beings who are looking for the shortcuts always.
Yeah.
So it's same with these patient recruitment campaigns. That's the shortcut. Like you have challenges, what do? You find the shortcut. Like you go to the campaigns, only to understand that this shortcut comes with other minuses and other side effects.
Well,
And these side effects are more budget, more time, and not always spent with the right results.
and it's also a very US centric approach to advertising. So,
True.
we, for these big phase 3 studies, we might have um, a lack of country specific websites set up for the studies.
Mm,
So it might be applied. So, for example, for all the English speaking countries, they might have just one website.
yeah.
And the challenge with that is there are nuances to things like that. And just to give you a specific example, in Australia, if you have the AU designation on your website, it tells the person that's on the website that this is an Australia
Mm,
based website.
mhm.
So whereas if they're just going to a .com website out of the US, then I think it can affect the confidence of the person who's based in Australia, because is this actually something local that's going on? And so it can affect confidence and trust, and I think there's a lot of advertising companies that don't understand these little nuances sometimes.
Yeah. And without understanding the patient journey, and I want to add actually something here. I do agree with you that there is a difference between standard of care, and let's say patient pathway, these are
Yeah,
all the same because it's defined by the access to treatment, access to healthcare in general.
correct.
But then the patient journey is the perception of the patients. It's how you live this throughout this patient pathway, how you experience the local standard
Right.
of care. So depending on what's the healthcare environment, you may trust the system or the other way around. And this
Yeah.
also contributes to the clinical research, let's say, results or lack of results, patient recruitment results or lack of results.
Yep.
So, without understanding this patient journey, you're making assumptions and you're even doing campaigns and like projects, um, but not targeting these people the right way without are targeting them with their needs and with their, let's say, what they want to hear and what they can, let's say, relate to. But that as one last question on my end, if you have to summarize, what is the implication, like from your perspective, what is the implication of not considering the patient journey before starting the clinical trial? What would that be? Maybe one or many implications from your perspective, from your experience.
Yeah. So I think that there's the obvious things we could talk about. So we could talk about how it negatively affects enrollment and the whole enrollment period in clinical trials, where it affects the ability to get the studies done on time, or we could talk about retention or things like that. But one of the things I wanted to throw at you was how it affects the investigator confidence.
Mm.
And so when a physician is participating in a clinical trial and they're doing the clinical trial and they're really excited and interested in this clinical trial, but there are things designed into the clinical trial that are preventing patients who really should be eligible but aren't for one
Right.
reason or another.
Mhm.
It affects their confidence in not only the clinical trial, but also the sponsor that's running the study. Because I think the thought process goes to, well, sponsor really doesn't understand these patients. And so ultimately at the end of the day, when a pharmaceutical company has the aim to sell a medication, the last thing you need is an investigator, a physician that doesn't have confidence in the company and
Of
believes that the
course.
company doesn't really understand the patients that have the condition being studied. And because we know that investigators, once a drug is approved, they're most likely to prescribe that medication because
Mm.
they're comfortable with it, they've had experience with it. But if that physician doesn't have confidence in the pharmaceutical company that's manufacturing the drug, it's going to affect sales at the end of the day.
Yeah, you're so right. And honestly, the confidence of the investigator was not something that I was thinking beforehand. So thank you so much for spending your time with me today
Oh,
and
my
sharing
pleasure.
actually this with me because yeah, it's another perspective of why understanding the patient journey is so important. And I've never thought of the investigator confidence and never thought beyond clinical trial, but you gave us a very big picture understanding why. Thank you so much, Ted.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun, Maya.